I've always had the habit of driving late at night coming back from work. That fall in Indiana, the rural roads were almost always deserted after 10 at night. I followed the route that used to cut the way to my house, a secondary road full of curves, without lighting and bordered by plantations. It was raining weekly, and the wet leaves stuck to the asphalt made the car slide slightly with each tighter curve. The radio barely got the signal, and that night, I decided to let only the noise of the engine and the sound of the rain accompany me. When I saw the car stopped on the side of the road, with the flasher on, I instinctively reduced it. It was common to see broken vehicles on that road, since few risked using it at night. But there was something strange. Even with the emergency lights flashing, there was no sign of anyone inside or outside the car. No shadow in the driver's seat, no figure walking around. Only the car stopped, illuminated intermittently by the flashing orange light. I passed slowly, trying to observe better. It was a dark sedan, an ordinary model, with rain-wet glass reflecting my headlights. When I left the car behind, the image got stuck in my mind, as if there was something wrong that I couldn't identify right away. For safety, I increased the speed and continued down the road, looking through the rearview mirror from time to time. The car was left behind, disappearing into the darkness. I tried not to think about it anymore. A few kilometers ahead, however, when the stretch became even more isolated, I saw headlights appear in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another driver coming in the same direction. But as the light approached, I realized that it was the same sedan that I had seen stop minutes before. The heart raced. How had that car stopped on the side of the road with no one inside, and now it was behind me, so close, as if it wanted to pressure me? I kept calm, or at least I tried. There was nowhere to go out, only the narrow road, the trees and the rain that was starting to thicken. The car behind me didn't overtake, didn't reduce. It was glued, illuminating the entire interior of my car with the high headlights. I squeezed the steering wheel hard, my shoulders tense, every muscle of my body stiff. I could only think of accelerating, but I also didn't want to run too much on that slippery road. The psychological game seemed endless. I looked through the rearview mirror and saw only those headlights, too close. No movement, no attempt to deflect or overtake. Just following me, as if he intended to keep me under surveillance. I felt a knot in my stomach, that unmistakable feeling of imminent danger. I thought about taking my cell phone to call someone, but there was no network signal in that rural part. I was completely alone. After almost 15 minutes with the car glued to my back, I saw a dark intersection ahead. It was a fork without plates, rarely used, which led to an even more isolated road. I decided to go straight, keeping the route I knew, but something inside me said that the car could try something there. I slowed down to face the curve, and at that moment the headlights behind me disappeared. I stopped the car for a few seconds, not believing it. I looked through the rearview mirror, turned my head back, but there was nothing. No headlights, no vehicle shadow. Only the total darkness and the rain dripping on the asphalt. I took a deep breath, trying to process what had happened. Maybe the car had entered the secondary road of the intersection. But I would have seen the movement, the curve, the headlights turning. There was nothing like that. The car just disappeared. I kept driving, but the silence inside the car seemed deafening. The sound of the rain didn't calm me down anymore. On the contrary, every drop against the glass seemed to echo along with the memory of those headlights chasing me. I spent the last few miles back home constantly looking through the rearview mirror, hoping that at any moment the car would appear again, glued to my rear. When I finally parked in the garage, I turned off the engine and sat quietly, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and cold sweat ran down my forehead, even with the cold night air coming in through the window. I got out of the car in a hurry, locking the door with unnecessary force, and entered the house without looking back. It was as if the simple act of looking could make that car reappear. In the following days, I went back to using the main road, even if it was longer and busier. I never wanted to go through the same place where that car appeared again. To this day, when I remember the flasher flashing alone on the side of the road, and then the headlights glued to my car without ever overtaking, I feel the same anguish of the night I realized that there was something, or someone chasing me. I don't know what would have happened if I had stopped on the side of the road, or tried to confront that situation. I don't know if it was a real threat, someone playing with my mind, or something impossible to explain. All I know is that it was one of the longest nights of my life. And sometimes I wonder, what if that car reappears in my back someday? Story 2. Driving at night was never a problem for me, But on that trip through the interior of Vermont, something happened that completely changed my relationship with secondary roads. I was returning from a visit to a friend and decided to cut off a route that I almost never used. It was early November. The wind brought the characteristic smell of wet leaves, and the rain fell intermittently, making the asphalt even more treacherous. The trees formed a natural tunnel on the road, and my car's headlights could barely illuminate beyond a few meters. The road was completely empty, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. The most critical stretch was a narrow, old, reinforced wooden bridge that crossed a small river. I had passed by her before during the day and remembered her precarious appearance, the boards creaking under the weight of the vehicles and the white paint of the railing almost erased by time. At night, in the rain, it seemed even more threatening. When my headlights touched the entrance of the bridge, I noticed something strange. There was someone standing right in the middle of the track. At first I thought it was an illusion caused by the light reflecting on the wet boards, but soon I clearly distinguished the figure of a man. He was standing still, motionless, with his soaked clothes sticking to his body. The hands fallen to the side, and the face turned directly to me. The sensation was immediate. A knot in the stomach, shortness of breath, the mind trying to find a logical explanation for that. Who would be in the middle of a narrow bridge, in the middle of the rainy dawn, without any cars around? I slowed down, still trying to understand the situation. My headlights lit the scene better. He was a tall man, maybe 40 or 50 years old, with his hair stuck by the water and dark clothes. The fixed gaze seemed to go through the windshield and hit me directly. I couldn't see expression. I didn't know if it was a request for help, provocation, or just someone out of his opinion. But immobility was what made me most restless. He didn't move, he didn't gesture, he didn't give any sign of reaction to my car approaching. I couldn't just speed up and run over him, but I also didn't want to stop completely in the middle of that narrow bridge. Then instinctively, I blinked the headlights twice, as if I wanted to signal something. It was at that moment that everything became even more disturbing. The figure simply disappeared. He didn't run to the side, didn't fall, didn't take any steps. One moment it was there, clearly visible, and the next second, there was nothing. I braked abruptly, the car almost slid on the wet wood, and I stood still looking forward, my eyes wide, my hands trembling holding the steering wheel. The headlights illuminated only the empty bridge, the reflection of the rain on the asphalt, and the motionless trees in the background. There was no sign of anyone. I went down the glass a little, in an attempt to hear something, and the only sound was that of the water hitting the boards and the river running under the bridge. The first thought I had was to get out of there as soon as possible. But the fear that the figure might suddenly appear in front of the car again made me hesitate. I squeezed my eyes, trying to examine every detail, every shadow. No movement. So I hit the first gear and crossed the bridge slowly, my heart beating so hard that it seemed to echo in the silence of the cabin. Every second seemed to drag on, and with every meter traveled I hoped that something would arise again. When I reached the end of the bridge, I took a deep breath, but the tension did not decrease. The road was still deserted, and the trees formed a dark corridor that seemed to swallow me. I looked through the rearview mirror several times, hoping to see the man standing where I had seen him. But the reflection showed only the intense rain and the erased contour of the bridge falling behind. The feeling of being observed continued, as if that presence was still there, close. In the following minutes, I drove in absolute silence, without even turning on the radio. I just wanted to get home, but every bend of the road seemed to hide some surprise. At certain times, I had the impression of seeing fast figures among the trees, but it could only be the effect of the rain and my mind on high alert. Even so, I kept the speed constant, without risking stopping again. When I finally reached a more open stretch, illuminated by an isolated pole, I felt a brief relief. I parked for a few seconds on the side of the road, turned off the headlights, and tried to catch my breath. The silence of the night, broken only by the rain, made me realize how tense I was. My hands hurt from holding the steering wheel so much, and cold sweat ran down my neck. Still, something inside me told me not to stand there for too long. I got home later than I expected, exhausted, but I couldn't sleep that night. The scene was constantly repeating in my head, the man motionless, soaked, and then simply disappearing before my eyes. I thought about telling someone the next day, but I already knew how it would sound. Who would believe in a story like that? It would be easily discarded as imagination, reflection of rain, tiredness. But to this day I remember the sharpness of that figure and the fixed look that seemed to cross the night and trap me on the road. It wasn't a blur, it wasn't a quick shadow. I clearly saw a man standing in the middle of the bridge, and he disappeared without leaving any sign. Since then, I avoid secondary roads on rainy nights, and I wonder, if I had stopped the car completely, would it have approached? Story 3. I always hated driving long distances at night, but that week I had no choice. I was going back to college in the countryside of Pennsylvania after spending the weekend with my parents. The road was rural, full of curves, almost without lighting and deserted most of the time. The fine rain hit the windshield and the wiper worked at maximum, creating that repetitive noise that somehow only made the night quieter. I was tired, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the track, because any distraction could mean an accident. It was in this state of alertness that I noticed something that would completely change that trip: a red truck appearing behind me. At first I didn't give much importance. It was not uncommon for a car to appear suddenly, especially on stretches of road with no side exit for miles. But there was something in that truck that immediately made me uncomfortable. The headlights were too high, almost blinding me by the rearview mirror. And she kept herself too close to my car, as if she wasn't in a hurry to overtake, but she didn't want to give me space either. I squeezed the steering wheel hard, telling myself that I was just an impatient driver. Even so, I decided to speed up a little, just to see if she moved away. The answer was immediate. The truck accelerated too, keeping exactly the same distance, as if it were stuck in my shadow. The noise of the heavy engine was audible even through the rain and the sound of my car. I felt my heart shoot, trying to ignore the panic that was beginning to take over. I suddenly slowed down, waiting for the vehicle to take the opportunity to overtake me, but it didn't. It simply reduced along with me, as if imitating all my movements. Every turn I made, every lane change, the truck reproduced. There was no way that could be a coincidence. My mind began to create scary hypotheses. Someone trying to follow me, maybe a drunk playing on the road, or something worse. I knew I needed to stay calm, but the feeling of being cornered left me breathless. I tried to focus on the details. The truck was old, maybe from the 80s or 90s, the red paint faded and full of rust, and the bumper seemed to be dented. I needed a safe place, and the only one that came to my mind was the gas station that was about 10 minutes away. It was the only illuminated point in the middle of that darkness, and I knew that if I could get there would be at least other people around. I kept the speed constant, without giving signs of panic, but inside my heart was racing. When I finally saw the lights of the post coming up ahead, it was like a momentary relief. I entered quickly, parking near the pump closest to the convenience store. At that moment, I was sure I would see the truck stop behind me. But, to my surprise, she passed straight, accelerating down the road without slowing down. I released the air, feeling my whole body relax, as if I had gotten rid of a nightmare. Even so, I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to decide if I should continue traveling or wait a little longer. The gas station attendant looked at me, probably wondering about my nervous expression, but I didn't want to go in and explain anything. I decided it was better not to delay my arrival any longer. I went back to the road, more confident that I had left the truck behind. I turned on the radio, trying to distract my mind and convince myself that everything was just paranoia. For a few minutes, the trip seemed normal again. The white stripes reflecting the light of the headlights, the constant rain falling, and the silence of the interior of the night. But this relief didn't last long. When I turned a long curve, my stomach sank. On the side of the road, stopped and with the headlights off, was the same red vehicle. The truck was there, parked, as if waiting for me. I passed straight, not daring to look at the driver. But from the rearview mirror I could swear that the cabin was occupied, even in the darkness. The panic came back immediately, and my hands were shaking so much that I almost lost control of the steering wheel. This time there was no more doubt. I was being followed. The car turned on the headlights and returned to the road right behind me, sticking again to my rear. My chest burned with so much fear, and I was already thinking of all the possible routes to mislead that driver. I knew that if I entered a smaller road, I could end up cornered, but continuing straight left me exposed. There was no easy way out. The chase continued for several kilometers. Sometimes I thought about taking my cell phone and calling the police, but my hands could barely let go of the steering wheel. I was afraid that any distraction would be enough to have an accident. My only hope was to find another illuminated area, another post, anything that would allow me to escape from that torment. But the road was endless, with only dark trees on each side. At one point, I took a deep breath and decided to try something risky. Slow down until it almost stopped, forcing the car to reduce so much that the truck would have to take some action. To my surprise, she didn't overtake or move aggressively. She just stayed there, glued to me, as if she had all the time in the world. That was even more disturbing than if he had tried something direct. It was as if I just wanted to prolong my fear. When I finally saw a sign indicating an exit to a small town, I turned the steering wheel abruptly and entered. The truck hesitated for a few seconds, and my heart stopped. But to my relief, she went straight, continuing along the main road. I parked right on the first illuminated street in the city and stood there, breathing fast, trying to understand what had just happened. I had no words, just the certainty that that night would be marked forever. To this day, when I remember that trip, I feel the same feeling of being watched, chased by someone who never showed himself completely. I never knew who drove that truck, nor why they chose me to follow. All I know is that since then, every time I see an old red vehicle in the rearview mirror, my whole body freezes. And the question that never leaves my head is, if I hadn't stopped at the gas station, how far would he have gone? Story 4. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't like to risk driving with the tank almost empty, especially on rural roads and at night. But on that trip through the countryside of Kentucky, I underestimated the distance between cities. It was autumn, a rainy night, and the road seemed to have no end. The wet leaves stuck to the windshield, and the tires threw water to the sides at every turn. When I saw the lights of a gas station appearing in the middle of the darkness, it was like an immediate relief. I already imagined the smell of gasoline, the feeling of finally being safe for a few minutes, before continuing the trip. I leaned the car slowly near the pumps. The sign looked old, but still shone partially, and some lights at the post blinked irregularly. I found it strange, but I didn't suspect it right away. I got out of the car, pulling my jacket to protect myself from the fine rain that was starting to thicken. I went straight to the pump, and only then I realized that there was no sign of operation. The dials were off, the hose looked too old, and the price screen didn't even turn on. I approached the door of the convenience store, but the internal lights clearly showed dusty shelves and no movement. I knocked on the glass a few times, calling for someone. No one answered. That's when I felt that uncomfortable silence, the kind that only exists when something isn't right. The road was completely deserted, and the only sound was from the rain hitting the metal roof of the post. While looking inside, I noticed something even stranger. A lamp at the back of the store flashed as if someone had just turned it on. It wasn't an old burning lamp, it was an irregular blink, as if it were responding to some presence. I went back to the car, trying not to think too much. Maybe it was just an abandoned building, and I had confused the lights outside with movement. But when I turned around to get in the car, I noticed something that froze me inside. There were wet footprint marks on the concrete floor, very sharp, coming out of the store door towards my car. They weren't there when I arrived, because I would have seen them. They were recent, fresh, printed by rainwater, as if someone had just left. My first impulse was to look around, but the post seemed completely empty. The corners were too dark, and the shadows of the rain hitting the roof gave the impression of movement everywhere. I took a deep breath, telling myself that someone had probably passed by before. But the more I looked at the footprints, the more I realized they stopped right next to my car door on the driver's side. It was as if someone had leaned there. I entered quickly, locking all the doors. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely breathe. I turned on the engine, and the headlights lit up the front of the station. At that moment, I swear I saw something move behind the store glass. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't a shadow of the rain. It was a still silhouette, motionless, as if watching me from the inside. I blinked, and the flashing light behind suddenly disappeared, leaving only the pitch of the abandoned store. I stepped on the accelerator, but my body hesitated. A part of me wanted to run away, never look back, but another part wanted to understand what I had just seen. The road ahead was empty and dark, and for some reason it seemed even more threatening than the post. But staying there was not an option. The footprints next to my car were proof enough that I wasn't alone in that place. I drove a few meters until I left the illuminated area, but the feeling did not pass. My eyes went back to the rearview mirror all the time, waiting to see someone running after me, or maybe another car following me. The post was small in the distance, just a patch of flashing light in the middle of the darkness. But the discomfort stayed with me. No matter how much I tried to rationalize, I had no way to explain those footprints that came out of nowhere. In the rest of the trip, I didn't see any more cars, no human movement, nothing. Only the constant rain and the engine sound. But fear turned into paranoia. Any headlight flashed behind me, any shadow on the side of the road, seemed like a direct threat. I found myself driving faster than I should, just to finish that stretch soon and get to some inhabited place. I arrived in the next city with the tank almost dry, but I still managed to refuel at a normal station. When I asked the gas station attendant about the station on the road, he looked at me confused. He said that place had been closed for years, after a small fire that was never fixed. No one used that for a long time. I asked if it was possible that there was still an electric light on, and he said no, the energy company had cut it years ago. That made me even more disturbed. If there was no power, how did the lights flash? And more importantly, who or what left those wet footprints coming out of the locked door? I spent the rest of the night turning it in my head, unable to sleep properly. The more I thought, the more I was convinced that someone or something still used that place as a shelter. Since then, I've never stopped at roadside posts, especially when they seem too old to still be working. It may have been just my mind playing tricks. It may have been a homeless person who hid when he saw me, but nothing takes out of my head the feeling that those footprints were for me. As if someone knew I would stop there, exactly that night. Story 5. That night still comes back to my mind with an uncomfortable sharpness. I was returning from a job in the interior of Maine, driving along those narrow roads that cut through forests and hills covered with red and golden leaves. It was already past 11, and the air was cold enough to foit the glass inside. The radio didn't get any more signal, and the fog was so thick that the lighthouse seemed to hit a white wall. I just wanted to get to the next motel and rest. The stretch I crossed was full of closed curves and no shoulder. I slowed down almost until I stopped, because the floor was damp and slippery. That's when I saw, or thought I saw, a silhouette right in the middle of the road. A man, standing still, completely motionless. He wore a heavy coat, maybe brown or gray, hard to say in that dim light. He was facing the car, with his face covered by the shadow of the hood. Instinctively, I stepped on the brake and felt the car slide. The heart raced, and for a second I thought I was going to run over it. But when the car stopped, the man was no longer there. The curve was empty. I got out of the car shaking, opened the door and looked around, but I only saw the fog moving slowly like smoke. No sound, no footprints on the edge of the track. The feeling was that he had never been there. I went back to the car trying to convince myself that it was just tiredness, a reflection of light, something like that. I kept driving slowly, but the image of that man stopped in the middle of the road couldn't leave my head. Every time I blinked, I saw his contour again, stiff, motionless, as if he was still watching me. A few more kilometers ahead, I saw a sign indicating a small motel. The sign flashed with old lights, and the parking lot was completely empty. I stopped the car and entered the reception. The place was old, with worn carpet and the smell of wet wood. The attendant, a gray-haired man, seemed surprised to see someone coming at that time. He handed me the key to room number 3 and asked if I came by the Hill Road. I said yes and told what had happened. The man was quiet for a moment, then shook his head and said, "You're not the first." I asked what he meant, and he told me that for years drivers appeared there in the middle of the night, scared, saying they had seen the same man on the curve. According to the attendant, decades ago a local resident had died there, trying to cross the road on a foggy night. The body was only found days later, a few meters from the curve. Since then, whenever the fog is too dense, someone says they see his figure standing at the same point. I laughed nervously, trying not to show the discomfort, but the man just stared at me and said, "The strangest part is that he only appears to those who are driving alone." I thanked him, took the key and went to the room. Inside, the sound of rain hitting the tiles was constant. I closed the curtains, but for some reason I left the lamp on. I tried to sleep, but every time I started napsing, I heard something like footsteps outside, slow, dragged, going back and forth on the sidewalk. I got up and went to the window. The fog covered almost everything, but I swear I saw a shadow stop near the car. I watched for a while, and the silhouette seemed to sway slightly, as if breathing. I blinked and she disappeared, swallowed by the fog. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the curtain. When it dawned, I went down to the parking lot. The car was covered with water droplets and fresh mud, with footprint marks on the driver's side, but only one sequence, as if someone had approached and stopped there. I went back to the reception and asked if the attendant had seen someone wandering around the motel. He just shrugged and said, "You were lucky. Most who see that man end up coming back here, saying that he follows them for a few nights." I tried to laugh, but my voice failed. That same morning, I packed my bags and left without looking back. When I passed again through the stretch of the curve, I slowed down and looked carefully at the shoulder. The fog was still there, and for a brief moment, I swear I saw the contour of someone standing at the same point. Since then, I avoid driving alone at night. But sometimes, when the car window fogs up and the headlight reflects in the fog, I feel the same pressure in my chest, as if someone were there, standing in the middle of the road waiting. And you? Would you keep driving if you saw someone standing on the curve in the fog? Or would you try to understand what is really watching you? Story 6. That trip was supposed to be quiet. Just me and my brother, 2 days on the road crossing Tennessee, listening to music and stopping at small restaurants along the way. It was the height of autumn, and the trees formed a golden tunnel on the asphalt. I remember exactly the feeling of calm until we saw that sign fallen on the side of the road, almost covered by leaves and mud. It said Old Pine Road in peeled white letters. Apparently it was a rural detour, and the GPS marked a shorter route there. My brother suggested that we continue, saying that we would cut half an hour of travel. I hesitated. The asphalt ended a few meters later, and the dirt road seemed too narrow. Still, we decided to try. As soon as we entered, the sound of the gravel under the tires was replaced by dry leaves, and the light began to change. The sun seemed to filter in a different way in there, weaker, as if the air had become dense. The road snaked between red trees and twisted trunks. In some stretches, the leaves completely covered the ground, and you couldn't know where the path ended. About 15 minutes passed until we noticed something strange, a fallen tree on the side, which we had seen before. We swear we passed by it, with that same broken branch pointing to the road. We laughed, trying to justify. Maybe they are similar trees. But the laughter didn't last long. 5 minutes later, we saw an old wooden fence with a crooked hanging sign, written private property. It was identical to the one we had seen at the beginning. We stood the car, got off and looked around. Everything seemed the same humid smell of earth, and the same sound of the leaves moving. No sign of houses or farms, only trees. We went back to the car and decided to turn around. That's when I noticed that the air was different, colder, and the wind had stopped completely. The noise of the tires on the road seemed muffled, almost distant. I turned on the GPS again, but the signal had disappeared. No map, no coordinate. Just a locked screen showing the car in the middle of a gray space. After a few minutes, we passed again through the same point of the fence with the private property sign. But this time, the fence was broken. My brother looked at me and asked if we had taken the right turn. I confirmed that yes, that we were returning the same way. The truth is that fear was already beginning to accumulate in the stomach. We followed in silence, our eyes fixed on the road. The sound of the engine seemed to echo in a strange way, as if the trees returned every noise. Then we saw something that made us freeze. The same sign fallen on the side of the road, Old Pine Road, but now it was on the opposite side, as if we had just entered and not left. We stopped the car, turned off the engine and listened. There was no sound of wind, no birds or anything. Just that dense, almost physical silence. We went out and walked a few meters to the sign. The floor was covered with leaves, but under them, you could see recent tire marks, ours, but going in the opposite direction. That's when we noticed something even stranger. There were human footprints around the plate. They weren't ours. They were boot marks, sunk in the mud, circling the point where the sign was. As if someone had stood there, watching the road. We went back to the car, and this time we decided to move on, even without knowing where we were going to end up. We drove for about 10 minutes until the road started to open and the GPS started working again. A blue dot shook on the map, and we finally managed to get out on a main road. We stopped at the first post we found, and went down without saying a word. The gas station attendant, a gray-bearded man, asked where we came from. When we answered Old Pine Road, he frowned and said, "This road was closed more than 10 years ago. There was a bad accident there. Since then, the county has removed all the plates." I looked at him and assured him that we had seen the fallen sign. He shook his head and replied, "So you saw more than you should." The next morning, we came back with the absurd idea of proving to ourselves that it was no big deal. But when we reached the exact point where we had turned, there was no road at all, just a continuous fence and a closed forest. No plate, no tire trace, nothing. To this day, I avoid driving on alternative routes. And sometimes I wonder if Old Pine Road really existed, or if we somehow ended up entering a place that shouldn't be there anymore. And you? Would you follow an unknown road just out of curiosity, or would you trust the feeling that there are paths that should never be reopened? Story 7. I never thought I'd live something like that, but to this day I can't sleep well when I remember that night. It was October, autumn season in Ohio, and the campus was empty because many colleagues had returned to their cities. I was alone in the apartment, thinking it would be quiet to take advantage of the silence to study and rest. It was raining hard outside, and the sound of the water against the windows always made me a little calmer. But that night, instead of relaxing, the rain seemed to increase the feeling of isolation. I was already lying down when I heard loud knocks on the balcony door. The sound was dry and insistent, as if someone was in a hurry to be attended. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe some deceived neighbor, but when I heard a male voice on the other side, my heart raced. He said he needed to use the phone because the car had broken down on the nearby road. I wasn't expecting anyone, and that immediately made me uncomfortable. The balcony of my apartment was on the second floor, which was already strange. To get there, the person would have to cross the entire parking lot and climb the external stairs. I went to the door without opening it and asked what he wanted. He repeated the same story, but this time he hit harder, almost as if he was testing the resistance of the glass door. My intuition screamed not to open. He said he couldn't help and that he would call the police if he didn't leave. For a few seconds, silence returned, only the rain hitting the glass. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had worked out, until I heard footsteps moving away from the balcony deck. I waited a while, trying to convince myself that the situation was resolved. I went back to the room, but the feeling that there was still someone outside wouldn't let me. I had locked the doors before lying down, and it gave me some comfort, but the nervousness did not go away. About 10 minutes later, while trying to fall asleep, I heard footsteps again. But they didn't come from the balcony. They were in the inner corridor of the apartment, inside. My body froze in bed. The sound was slow, dragged, as if the person was trying not to make noise, but the floor creaked slightly with each movement. I knew I couldn't be listening to that, because I hadn't left any door open. I got up slowly, with my heart pounding, and went to the corridor. The apartment was dark, except for the dim light that came in through the windows. That's when I realized that the window of my room, the one I was sure was closed, was ajar. The wet curtain flittered with the cold wind of the rain, and there were mud marks on the parapet. At that moment, I understood that someone had managed to get in. I didn't think twice. I ran back to the room, locked the door, and took my cell phone. I called 911 almost without being able to speak properly. I explained that there was someone inside the apartment and that I was locked in the room. The attendant asked me to calm down and said that the police were on their way. As I spoke, I heard heavy footsteps circulating around the room and an object falling to the floor, as if someone had bumped into something. They were the longest minutes of my life. I held the bedroom handle tightly, afraid it would be rotated at any moment. The silence returned for a few moments, then came the noise of footsteps again, as if the person was wandering around, deciding what to do. The sound stopped right in front of the bedroom door, and I could swear that someone was on the other side, just listening to my rapid breathing. When I finally heard the sirens in the distance, the footprints began to rush towards the balcony. The bedroom window slammed hard, as if it had been closed in a hurry. Soon after, the police knocked on the main door, and I ran out to open it. They searched the entire apartment, but found no one. They just confirmed the mud marks on the window and some wet footprints on the living room floor. They said it was probably an intruder trying to break into houses during the night, and that I was lucky not to have opened the door. They collected some evidence, but never called me saying they had found someone. I spent weeks without being able to sleep, jumping with fright at every noise from the street. Even after changing the locks and installing extra locks on the windows, the feeling of insecurity never left me completely. Telling this now gives me goosebumps, because I really don't know what would have happened if I had opened that balcony door. The idea that someone could be watching me while I slept that night is terrifying. To this day, I can't hear knocks on the door without feeling my whole body freeze. And I ask you, have you ever had the feeling that someone entered your house without being invited? If you were in my place, would you have opened the door to help that man? Story 8. I worked for a while in a 24-hour market in the interior of Vermont, and to this day I have difficulty explaining a situation that happened to me during an autumn shift. The market was small, basically we served truck drivers, people returning from night work, and some residents of the region. As always, I spent most of the night alone at the cash register, with the feeling that nothing really dangerous could happen there, since it was a quiet city. But there was a particular customer who started to get my attention. This man always came at completely random times. He never seemed to follow a pattern. Sometimes he showed up at 2 in the morning, sometimes at 5, and on some occasions he arrived a little after midnight. The detail is that he never bought anything that made much sense. Once it took only 1 pack of batteries. In another, he bought several cans of energy drink and left without exchanging a word. He always had a restless look, as if he was checking who else was around. I tried not to give importance, but I couldn't avoid the strangeness. The episode that really marked me happened on a cold autumn night. I was alone at the cash register. It was past 3 in the morning, when he entered through the automatic door. This time, he was panting, with his face sweaty despite the cold outside. He didn't respond to my greeting. He just went straight to one of the shelves. He took 2 large padlocks, put them on the counter, and stared at me while I passed the codes on the reader. The way he held the objects, in a hurry, made me uncomfortable. The silence was suffocating. I always tried to start a conversation with customers to break the mood, but at that moment I felt I shouldn't say anything. The noise of the fine rain outside, and the sound of the scanner passing the products seemed even louder. He took a note out of his pocket and put it on the counter, without looking at me. He took the padlocks quickly and left without saying a word. That left me with a weird feeling, as if I had just participated in something I didn't understand. Normally, I could forget a strange client in a few minutes, but this time it was different. I had the feeling that there was something urgent and dangerous behind that purchase. The way he breathed heavily, his restless look, and especially the padlocks left me wondering what he could use at that time of the morning. I stood still, looking at the automatic door closing behind him, with my heart racing. After he left, I realized that I got tense with each noise. Every car that passed slowly on the road in front of the market gave me goosebumps. At one point, I thought I had seen the same man standing near the parking lot, in the shade, holding the bags, but when I focused my eyes I couldn't see anything anymore. It may have been my impression, but that made me restless for the rest of the morning. In the following days, he came back a few more times. The purchases were still strange: ropes, flashlights, adhesive tapes, things that in isolation would not attract attention, but together sounded even more suspicious. I couldn't understand why someone would buy these things at such specific times, always late at night. When I commented with colleagues, they laughed and said that I was exaggerating, that I was probably someone with weird hobbies or a handyman from the region. But something inside me said it wasn't quite that. What bothered me the most was the way he looked at me. I never smiled, I never said goodnight, I just watched in silence. I felt that he was evaluating whether he could trust me or not, as if I were just another detail within something much bigger. Every time he left the market, I kept wondering if I should have done something, asked more, or even called the police. But at the same time, there was nothing concrete other than strange purchases. One night in particular left me even more shaken. He ran in, almost bumped into the shelf, took some packages of thick tape and another flashlight, and left the same way in silence. Only this time, when he passed through the door, I realized that his car was parked in a dark corner of the parking lot, with the trunk open. It was impossible not to feel a chill when imagining what could be in there. That morning, I was looking out the window whenever I had no customers. His car was still stopped, and I saw him open the trunk more than once. But from where I was I couldn't see exactly what he was doing. All I know is that, in a moment, he raised his head and looked directly at the market window. It was fast, but enough for me to look away, afraid that he had noticed that I was watching him. After that night, he just stopped showing up. No visits, no strange purchases, nothing. It disappeared out of nowhere, as if it had never existed. I was relieved, but at the same time even more curious, because there was no explanation. I didn't know his name. I had never registered anything other than cash payments. It was as if I had passed by there just to leave a trail of restlessness. To this day, when I think about it, I find myself wondering what those padlocks bought at 3 in the morning were for, or the rope, or the ribbon. I wonder if someone disappeared at that time, or if any house was locked or abandoned in a strange way. I've never seen anything in the newspapers, but I also know that not everything appears in the news. What I know is that something about that man was not normal, and I feel that he was hiding something dangerous. I try to convince myself that maybe I exaggerated, that he was just an eccentric client, but this doubt never left my head. To this day, when I remember the way he looked at me in silence, It seems like he was telling me that I knew too much, even without knowing anything. And that's why I decided to share this story here, because I don't know if it was just my paranoia or if I really crossed paths with someone dangerous. And you? Have you ever had contact with someone who seemed to use common places, such as a market or a gas station, just as a facade for something much darker? Story 9. I was 15 years old when I spent a weekend with my cousin at her house in the countryside of Pennsylvania. Her parents had traveled to visit relatives, and we were alone for 2 days. The house was old, with a large and furnished basement, where we liked to play video games because it was cooler and quieter. I've always liked old houses, but on that rainy autumn night something made that place look different, as if it was more empty and noisy at the same time. Maybe it was just the sound of the rain hitting the windows and the wind in the trees, but I already had a strange feeling. While we were playing, we began to hear a sound coming from the top of the house. At first it seemed just the clapping of the wood with the wind, but then it became clearer. It was as if someone was moving the back door. We looked at each other without saying anything, trying to disguise, until we heard a light knock on the door glass. I froze. We paused the game and were silent, with our eyes fixed on the stairs that led to the kitchen, as if we expected someone to come down at any moment. We created courage and went up together, each one holding a video game controller as if it could protect us. When we arrived in the kitchen, we saw marks on the door glass. They were wet hand marks, well defined, sliding as if someone had passed their palms and fingers there. The rain was still heavy outside, but what gave me goosebumps was that we didn't see anyone in the backyard, no silhouettes, no steps. Only those brands, fresh, as if they had just been made. My cousin went to the side window and tried to look out, but all she could see was the darkness and the reflection of the kitchen lights. I stood looking at the door glass, and I was sure those marks weren't there before. My cousin swore she had closed the door with the key as soon as night fell, because that's what her parents always asked. Still, seeing that moved us. We decided to go down again to the basement, trying to ignore what we had seen, but the tension stuck to us like the rain's own humidity. In the basement, the sound of thunder and the noise of water running down the roof seemed louder. We tried to get back to the game, but the concentration didn't come anymore. With each slap of the house, we looked at each other in silence. That's when we heard it again, a loud noise, as if someone was trying to move the back door lock. We ran to the stairs, but we didn't go up. We stood there, in the dark, listening to the repeated metallic sound. It was the key hitting the metal, as if someone was forcing it from the outside. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. The silence that came after was worse. We were afraid to go up again, but we couldn't stand it, and, with a lot of hesitation, we went together to the kitchen. This time, we saw that the lock was crooked, scratched, as if it had been forced. There was no one, but it was impossible not to feel that someone had really tried to get in. My cousin took the landline to call her parents, but the line was silent. Just hissing. We ran down to the basement, almost stumbling on the steps, and pushed a bookshelf against the door. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe it was just some crazy neighbor or a bad joke. But the neighborhood was far away. The nearest house was almost a kilometer away. And who would do that in the middle of a storm, in the dark, in such an isolated place? The logic didn't help. We sat on the couch, hugging, looking at the stairs as if at any moment someone could go down. The dawn was long. We barely blinked, waiting for any sign of movement. The wall clock marked every minute, and it seemed that time was dragging on. Around 4 a.m, we heard another noise, this time in the side window. A dry sound like nails or a stone hitting the glass. We didn't have the courage to go up. We were shrunken in the basement, trying to ignore it, but the sound persisted for a few seconds before stopping. When the day finally dawned, we went up together, with our hearts racing. The kitchen floor was wet, not from the inside, but in front of the door, as if it had been forced again during the night. The lock was broken, almost hanging, and the hand marks on the glass seemed even sharper, as if someone had been standing there long enough, pressing their palms against the glass. That was the confirmation that we hadn't imagined anything. The strangest thing was that, despite all the effort in the lock, nothing from the house had been stolen. There were no signs of entry into the rest of the house, no broken windows, no open doors. It was as if the person had tried to enter several times and gave up, or worse, as if he just wanted to terrorize us. This was the part that bothered me the most, the idea that it was not an attempt to steal, but to scare. When my cousin's parents came back, we showed everything. They were shaken, but tried to calm us down, saying that it was probably just someone trying to steal, and that they couldn't. They called a locksmith to change the lock, but I saw on their faces that they were also scared. They knew something was wrong. That kind of thing was not common in that region, even more so during a rainy night when no one should be around. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I remembered the wet hands sliding through the glass and the metallic noise of the lock being forced. It wasn't just the fear of the moment, it was the feeling of vulnerability, of realizing that someone really wanted to enter the house while two teenagers were alone there. There was nothing we could have done if the person had succeeded. To this day, when I remember that night, I feel my stomach tighten. The worst part is not having answers. Who was that person? What did you want inside the house? Why didn't you take anything? Why did you just stop? We'll never know, but the memory of that wet door, the broken lock, and the silence of the basement still gives me chills. And I wonder, has anyone ever gone through something similar, to clearly feel that someone tried to enter, but without taking anything, just leaving marks as a warning? You've made it to the end. Thank you for listening until now. But before we close, I have one last story for you. I've always liked the idea of renting isolated places to work, especially during the fall, when the rain makes everything quieter and conducive to writing. That's how I decided to rent a wooden chalet in the interior of Maine. I needed a few days of tranquility to advance reports, and also to get away from the noise of the city. The ad showed a simple but cozy cabin with 2 bedrooms, a small living room with a fireplace, and a modest kitchen. When I arrived, I soon realized that the place seemed even more isolated than I had imagined. There were no close neighbors, and the way there was of dirt, full of wet leaves fallen from the trees. Still, the initial feeling was of peace, until the night came. On the first night, after organizing my things, I sat in the living room and listened to the rain hitting the windows while typing on my laptop. It was that typical forest silence. No cars passing by, no urban sound, only the water dripping and occasionally the wind swinging the branches. Around midnight, I decided to go to sleep. That's when I heard the first steps coming from the guest room upstairs. At first, I thought it was the wood creaking because of the humidity. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized that the noises had a cadence, as if someone was walking slowly from one side to the other. My heart started beating faster, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination, or even some animal that had managed to get in somehow. I took the flashlight and went up the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet. The corridor was dark, except for the faint light of the moon that entered through the cracks. When I arrived at the guest room door, it was ajar. I pushed slowly and felt an icy wind hit my face. The window was wide open, and the wet curtains swayed with the rain. It was at that moment that I realized the detail that left me paralyzed. There were mud marks on the carpet. They were poorly defined footprints, but it was clear that someone or something had entered there with wet feet. The room did not smell of dust, as would be expected in a little-used space, but a humid odor of wet earth. My breathing got heavy. I seamed the room with the flashlight, looked under the bed, inside the small closet, but there was no one. I closed the window, locking it, and went down to the living room, trying to convince myself that it was no big deal. I spent the rest of the night awake. Each snap of the house seemed louder than it should. I turned on the television to distract myself, but the noise of the rain muffled even the voices of the program. Around 3 a.m, I heard a sound coming from upstairs again, as if someone had closed a door. I went up again, this time with my heart racing, but I found everything apparently normal. I went back to bed, trying to sleep with the lights on, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, when I woke up, something even more disturbing awaited me. The guest room door was closed, and when I tried to open it, I realized it was locked. But not on the outside, but on the inside. There was no way I could have locked that door by myself, and I remembered perfectly leaving it just leaning after checking everything. I called out loud, as if I expected to hear some answer, but the silence was absolute. The air seemed colder in that corridor, as if something had really changed. I went back to the living room, trying not to panic. I took my cell phone to call someone, but the reception there was terrible. I could only open the messaging app with a lot of effort, and I didn't even have the courage to tell my friends what was happening. I spent the rest of the morning walking back and forth in the living room, constantly looking at the stairs, hoping to hear those steps again. But there was no sound at all, and this only increased the feeling that something was wrong. When I finally got up the courage to go up again, in the early afternoon, I found the guest room door unlocked. I didn't touch anything, I just glanced. The room seemed normal again. Closed window, dry curtain, no traces of mud. The carpet was practically clean, as if someone had rubbed it overnight. This inconsistency made me even more uncomfortable, because it meant that either my mind was playing very elaborate tricks, or someone had really been there. On the second night, I made a point of dragging a heavy piece of furniture and blocking the front door. I closed all the windows and left the kitchen light on. Still, around 2 in the morning, I heard something coming from above. It wasn't footsteps this time, but a sound like furniture being dragged. I stood still in the living room, with my hands shaking and my cell phone without signal. The noise lasted a few minutes, and then stopped completely. I didn't have the courage to go up to check. The next morning, the guest room door was again locked from the inside. I knew I wasn't imagining. I packed my bags as fast as I could, without looking up once. I loaded the car in silence, avoiding even opening the curtains. When I went to deliver the key, I didn't say anything to the owner. I just returned it and said I had decided to shorten my stay. He just nodded, without showing surprise. I returned home that rainy afternoon with the feeling that something had been left behind, or worse, that something had followed me. To this day, when I think of that open window, the mud marks and the locked door inside, I feel the same chill of the night I heard footsteps over my head. I can't explain what happened in that cabin, but I'm sure I wasn't alone inside. And to this day, when I hear footsteps coming from an empty room, I can't help but remember that first night in the cottage. Have you ever been through something like this, when everything points to someone inside your house, but there is absolutely no one to see? Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.